The ground shook so hard that my teeth rattled, and the loudspeaker above my head screamed the same warning it had screamed for the last 10 minutes. Final boarding call. All personnel report to the launch pad. The star is failing faster than predicted. I was not on the launch pad. I was 3 streets away, sprinting through a cloud of ash, trying to reach a nursery dome that had already lost half its roof. My name is Daniel Ward, and 6 months ago, I signed up for a relief mission that was supposed to be simple. Help a dying alien world called Threlos 9 move its people to safety before their sun collapsed. Nobody told me the timeline would collapse too. Nobody told me a countdown that once read 10 days would suddenly read 2 hours. The sky above me had turned a strange orange, like a fire trapped behind glass. Every few seconds, a tremor rolled through the ground, knocking loose bricks and sending clouds of dust into the air. I covered my mouth with my sleeve and kept running, because somewhere under that broken roof was a small creature who trusted me more than she trusted anyone else on this planet. Her name was Ember. She was a Threll cub, barely past infancy in her species, with fur the color of wet stone and eyes that glowed like small embers, which was exactly why I had named her that. For months she had followed me everywhere, sitting by my boots while I worked, learning bits of my language faster than I learned bits of hers. She was not supposed to matter to the mission. She had become the only thing that did. I reached the nursery dome and shoved through a gap in the fallen wall. Inside, the air was thick with dust, and the emergency lights flickered weakly. I called her name, and a thin, high sound answered from somewhere near the back, muffled by fallen debris. I moved fast, pulling aside broken support beams, ignoring the sharp edges that scraped my hands. Time was not a luxury I had. Every second I spent in that dome was a second closer to the final launch window closing forever. I found her wedged between 2 collapsed shelves, her back leg caught under a chunk of ceiling. She was shaking, her eyes wide, but the moment she saw me, she stopped crying and reached out one small paw toward my hand. I did not stop to think. I lifted the broken shelf with everything I had, feeling my arms burn, and pulled her free the instant it gave way. She pressed herself against my chest, trembling, and I held her there for exactly 1 second, before the loudspeaker screamed again. 90 minutes to final departure. All personnel must be aboard. 90 minutes. That was not a lot of time to cross a crumbling city, reach the transport ship, and convince anyone in charge that a cub who was not on any manifest deserved a seat. I ran. The streets outside had changed since I entered the dome. Cracks had spread across the road like spiderwebs, and in the distance, a support tower leaned at an angle it had not leaned at before. Threll families moved in long lines toward the evacuation point, carrying what little they could. None of them looked back at their homes. There was no time for looking back. I kept Ember tucked against my chest, one arm wrapped around her, the other free to catch myself if the ground gave way. She had stopped crying, but I could feel her heart racing against mine, matching the rhythm of my own. A woman's voice crackled through my earpiece. It was Grace Bennett, the mission captain, and she did not sound calm. "Daniel, where are you? We are closing the outer gate in 60 minutes. If you are not through it, you are not getting on this ship." I told her I was on my way, and I did not mention what I was carrying. There would be time for that argument later, if there was a later. The transport route ran along the edge of a canyon that the Threll called the Long Scar, a deep gorge that split the city in 2. The only bridge across it was old, built long before anyone expected the star to fail this soon. As I reached it, another tremor hit, stronger than the last, and I watched a crack race across the bridge's surface like a living thing. I did not slow down. I could not slow down. I ran across that bridge as it groaned beneath me, feeling sections shift under my boots, hearing pieces break away behind me and fall into the canyon below. Ember pressed her face into my jacket, and I kept my eyes fixed on the far side, refusing to look down. I reached solid ground, just as the middle section of the bridge gave way completely, crashing into the gorge in a cloud of dust and noise. I did not stop to watch. I kept running. The launch pad came into view 20 minutes later, a wide stretch of scorched earth surrounded by evacuation ships preparing for departure. Engines roared, and dust rose in thick waves from the ground. Lines of thrall moved up the ramps of smaller transport vessels, guided by relief workers checking names against lists. I spotted the ship I needed, its ramp already beginning to rise. I pushed through the crowd, calling out for Grace, and she appeared at the top of the ramp, waving me forward with an expression that shifted the moment she saw what I was holding. "You cannot bring her," Grace said, once I reached the top. "She is not on the manifest. There is no space allocated for her. The council set the numbers, and every seat is already accounted for." I told her that I would give up my own seat before I gave up this one. I told her that Ember had no one else, that her litter had not survived the first collapse, and that leaving her behind was the same as leaving a child behind. Grace was not a cruel woman. I could see the decision weighing on her, but rules on an evacuation ship exist for a reason, and she could not simply erase them because I asked. While we argued, the ground shook harder than it ever had before, and somewhere across the launch pad, a support strut on one of the smaller vessels buckled, sending a shower of sparks into the air. Workers shouted, pulling people away from the damaged ship. The countdown on the main display dropped below 30 minutes. Grace's radio crackled with a voice from Mission Control, warning that the star's outer layer had begun shedding faster than any model predicted, and that all ships needed to leave the moment their ramps closed, not a second later. I looked at Ember, who was looking back at me with those glowing eyes, her small paw still wrapped around one of my fingers. She had not let go since I pulled her from the rubble. "Wait for me," she said, in the broken words she had learned from me over the past 6 months. It was the clearest sentence she had ever spoken, and it landed harder than any argument I could have made. Grace heard it too. I watched something shift in her face, the same shift I had felt in my own chest the moment I found Ember trapped under that shelf. "There is one option," Grace said quickly. "If you leave your seat open for a Thrall elder still waiting at the gate, I can list her under emergency medical transport instead of passenger transport. It is not clean, and it will cause problems later, but it will get her on this ship." I did not hesitate. I told her to do it, and to do it fast, because the countdown was no longer generous with its numbers. Grace called it in, and within minutes, a relief worker rushed forward with a small medical carrier, the kind used for injured animals during transport. Ember did not want to let go of my hand, and I did not want to let go of hers, but I explained, as gently and as quickly as I could, that this carrier was the only way she could come with us. She finally released my finger, climbed into the carrier, and immediately reached one paw through the mesh opening, searching for my hand again. I gave it to her, and she held on as the ramp began closing behind us. The ship lifted off 11 minutes before the final window closed. Through the small viewport beside my seat, I watched Threlos 9 shrink beneath us, its orange sky glowing brighter as the star above it grew unstable. Somewhere behind that light, a bridge I had crossed only an hour earlier was already gone, and a city that had been full of life was falling silent. Ember sat in her carrier beside my seat, her paw still wrapped around my finger through the mesh, her eyes fixed on mine instead of the window. She did not look at the planet she was leaving. She looked only at the person who had come back for her. Grace walked past my seat once the ship reached a safe distance, glancing down at Ember with an expression that had softened considerably since the launch pad. "You broke about 6 regulations back there," she said. I told her I would break 6 more if it meant that paw stayed wrapped around my finger. Grace did not argue. She simply nodded and moved on to check the next row of passengers, leaving me alone with the small creature who had refused to let go, on a ship, carrying both of us far away from a world that no longer existed behind that fading orange light. Ember eventually fell asleep against my arm, her paw still holding my finger, even in rest. I stayed awake a while longer, watching the stars outside the viewport replace the dying orange glow, and I thought about how strange it was that the bravest thing I had ever done was not running across a collapsing bridge or lifting a broken shelf with my bare hands. It was refusing to let go of a promise, even when every rule in the world told me to.